The commanders are leaving Crimea, and they aren't waiting for permission. That single detail is the whole story, and almost none of what it actually means is visible on the surface. Senior officers of Russia's Black Sea Fleet are moving their families across the strait to Novorossiysk. They are selling off the possessions they can't carry. They are settling into new apartments in a new city. And they are doing all of this before any official evacuation order has come down from Moscow. When the people in charge of holding a position quietly arrange their own exit ahead of orders, they are answering a question the official narrative refuses to ask out loud. Can this place still be held? For 10 years, the Kremlin's answer was absolute. Crimea was the invincible fortress, the untouchable symbol of Russian power in the Black Sea. Billions spent, tens of thousands of troops. The fleet headquarters planted on the peninsula as a permanent fact. But the visible story, a few officers relocating, is not the real story. The real story is what their departure reveals about everything underneath it. And once you start pulling that thread, the fortress doesn't just look weakened, it looks like it's already gone. Here's what matters first. This exodus didn't begin in June. It's the final act of something that's been unfolding for over a year. The evidence is physical. In February 2026, demolition crews leveled the historic main headquarters building of the Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol, a structure that had stood for more than a century, a building that survived the Second World War. The literal symbol of Russian naval power in the south, reduced to rubble because a Ukrainian Storm Shadow missile in 2023 had already rendered it beyond repair. A retired Ukrainian naval officer put the strategic meaning bluntly to RFE/RL. There was nothing left to command in Sevastopol. Only old scrap and damaged ships. Sit with the sequence, because the order tells the story. First, the flagship Moskva went to the seafloor in 2022. Then the fleet's ships withdrew to Novorossiysk. Then the air bases were abandoned. Then the headquarters itself was demolished. And now, the last piece, the command echelon walks out the door. The trigger for this final stage was a strike on May 27th. Ukraine hit the aviation general headquarters on a street in Sevastopol with Storm Shadow missiles and destroyed the hardened communications infrastructure inside. Within days, according to independent sources, the officers began organizing their move. The Atesh partisan movement confirmed on June 14th that the plan to relocate the fleet's remaining command units to Novorossiysk was now in effect. But notice what each revelation does. The demolished building explained why the ships had gone. The departing command explains why the building no longer mattered, and every answer just exposes a larger one. If the symbol of Russian Black Sea power is being abandoned by the very people sworn to defend it, what does that say about the war itself? That's the question the rest of this story is built around. The departing commanders face a problem that should not exist for a victorious power. There is no safe way to leave their own fortress. Consider what that means before we get to how. A military that controls a territory should be able to move freely within and out of it. The fact that escape itself has become dangerous tells you the territory is no longer controlled. It's contested and increasingly besieged. Now the mechanics, and there are 4 routes, each one compromised. The Kerch Bridge, more than 500 kilometers of road from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, struck repeatedly throughout the war, seriously damaged, banned to fuel tankers, traffic interrupted constantly, security checks lasting hours. The exit queues grow, and the queues themselves become targets. The sea route, effectively closed. The last major ferry, the Slavyanin, was sunk by a Ukrainian operation in April. The small ferries that remain have limited capacity, and Ukrainian naval drones patrol the Kerch Strait around the clock. The land corridor, westward through occupied territory along the Melitopol to Mariupol to Rostov direction, on the R280 highway. Russia closed it to military cargo by its own order. Freight traffic dropped 71%. Convoys move at night in small groups, and Ukraine's thermal camera drones hunt in the dark. The air route, available only to the highest-ranking officials because the airports are under constant drone and missile attack, and the destination isn't safe either. That last point widens everything. Novorossiysk, the supposed sanctuary, has already been hit repeatedly by Ukrainian drones and missiles. Port facilities, oil depots, military infrastructure, all targeted. The real-time coordination needed for air support and coastal defense in Crimea becomes radically harder from across the water, and the distance the commanders are buying is meaningless against Ukraine's Flamingo missile, with a range of 3,000 kilometers. So here is the reframing that drives the rest of this analysis. The commanders are not buying security, they are buying distance, and distance is not the same thing as safety. Which raises the question they are trying not to think about, the one their soldiers are already asking. What does this flight mean for the roughly 50,000 soldiers left behind? The first effect is psychological, and it's the most corrosive. In any army, the flight of the command echelon transmits exactly one message to the ranks. This place can no longer be held. Atesh's reporting that fleet morale has collapsed confirms the dynamic. While commanders pack their families for Novorossiysk, the ordinary soldier left in Crimea asks the obvious thing. If they're leaving, why am I staying? When that question goes unanswered, the risk of insubordination, desertion, and collective disintegration multiplies. The second effect is operational. Moving the decision centers across the Kerch Strait severs Crimean units from real-time command support. Air defense coordination, coastal defense, inter-unit communications, all of it is anchored to a command center, now sitting 300 kilometers away in a different geography, running on already damaged infrastructure. The hardened communication systems were destroyed on May 27th, and some documents were lost with them. Rebuilding all of that in Novorossiysk takes time and resources. In the meantime, units in Crimea face an authority vacuum, where junior officers are forced into snap decisions their training and rank were never meant to carry. The third effect is the one that compounds. Crimea isn't just a garrison. It's the center of the Southern Front's air defense umbrella and its intelligence coordination. When the command structure fractures, coordination between the S-400 batteries and the radar systems weakens. Weaker coordination makes Ukrainian strikes more effective. And here, the trap closes into a cycle. Strikes drive command away. Command's flight weakens the defense. Weakened defense invites more strikes. And that cycle doesn't stay contained on the peninsula. Logistics coordination for the Zaporizhzhia front ran through this same command structure. So when command in Crimea collapses, the entire southern front feels it, which forces the unavoidable question one level up. Can Putin simply fix this? Can he send new commanders and reinforcements and reset the board? The answer was written months before the commanders started packing. According to an ISW report from March 2026, the situation had already inverted. Russia's problem in Crimea was no longer reinforcing the garrison, it was draining it. Casualties on other fronts had grown so severe that the peninsula's troops were being treated as a reserve pool to be cannibalized. The evidence is in the unit movements. The 810th Naval Infantry Brigade was shifted to the Kursk direction. The 55th and 120th Naval Infantry Divisions were sent to reinforce the 29th Army area on the Zaporizhzhia front. ISW's assessment was unambiguous. These very shifts were disrupting Russia's own spring offensive plans toward the fortress belt. So in March, the garrison was depleted and poured into the front lines. In June, the commanders followed them out. Crimea has now lost both its soldiers and its command. Could reinforcements come from somewhere else? Look at the map as of June 2026, and the answer is no. Every front is simultaneously under pressure. North, Kupiansk lost. Russia on the defensive toward Kupiansk's surroundings. Pulling troops leaves the north exposed. East, 60,000 soldiers stalled for 6 months in front of the fortress belt, unable to open the road to Kostiantynivka. Weakening that force further kills the Donbas plan entirely. South. The 58th Army collapsed with over 20,000 casualties. Ukraine's counteroffensive narrowed the corridor to 40 kilometers. Even holding defense is hard there. North again, via Belarus. A standing threat that ties down still more forces. There is no slack anywhere to spare for Crimea. And even if reinforcements existed, The logistics reality buries the idea. The peninsula's access arteries are largely cut. Sending more units to a garrison that already can't feed the troops it has doesn't solve the problem. It deepens it. So the strategic picture clarifies. Putin's Crimea equation offers fewer options with every passing day. And while his options shrink at the top, life at the bottom, inside Crimea itself, has already started to come apart. This collapse isn't only military, it's civilian, and it's visible in the most ordinary places: the fuel pump, the grocery shelf, the water tap. Fuel went first. On June 7th, Ukraine struck Crimea's two largest fuel depots, and distribution was suspended. Authorities rolled out a QR code coupon system, then canceled it almost immediately, because there was no fuel left to ration. The Russian-appointed Sevastopol governor admitted it plainly. Waiting in line is pointless. The fuel trucks cannot reach the city. Russia's own energy ministry acknowledged that drone attacks caused the crisis. Putin's response, "No drone attack will change the situation," was aimed not at Crimeans, who can see the empty stations, but at the domestic Russian audience. Then food. Per Ukraine's Center for Countering Disinformation, sugar, flour, grain, salt, and pasta have vanished from many stores in occupied Crimea. Retailers imposed per-customer purchase limits. The root cause is structural. Crimea cannot feed itself. The majority of its food came from the mainland, and that connection no longer functions. The R280 closure that hit military cargo crushed civilian traffic too. Daily crossings fell from 3,800 vehicles to 1,100. And demand is higher than ever because of the 200,000-plus Russian citizens, soldier families, retirees, civil servants, settled there since 2014. More mouths, less supply, then water. Bridges over the North Crimea Canal were struck, and the canal itself may be damaged. A significant share of the peninsula's agricultural and drinking water flowed through it. Now follow the consequence outward, because here a new stakeholder enters the frame: the civilian population itself. Independent analysts warned that armed units, hungry and cut off from supply, can turn on the civilians around them. History is full of besieged garrisons where exactly this happened. Crimea isn't there yet. But the trajectory points that way. Even tourism mirrors the rot. Hotel occupancy down 40%, 79% of reservations in the last 2 weeks canceled. One analyst's comparison lands hard. Crimea is starting to resemble the final days of the Soviet Union, goods quietly disappearing from shelves. Except, he notes, there's a crueler twist. Before the Soviet collapse, people from small towns could travel to Moscow for what they couldn't find at home. People in Crimea have no Moscow to go to. The only road out is closed. And the closing of that road is no accident. Ukraine isn't striking targets at random. It's running a systematic destruction campaign, and the target list expands every single week. Watch the layers stack. Layer 1, the bridges. Between June 7th and 11th, 7 bridges and crossing points linking Crimea to the mainland were hit. Chonhar, Arabat, the North Crimea Canal bridges, Stavki. No intact bridge remained. Russia built pontoon crossings to patch the gaps. Ukraine struck those too. Then, on the night of June 13th, the campaign escalated. Operators of the 475th Regiment hit the Jankoy checkpoint, a railway bridge, a Russian pontoon crossing, and military transport vehicles. Jankoy is the peninsula's single most important transport hub, the highway and rail junction wiring Russian forces in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia into Crimea. Disruption there ripples across the entire southern front. The operators themselves named the shift in doctrine. We are transitioning from isolated bridge attacks to continuously monitoring and hunting enemy logistics lines. Layer 2. Production. On the same night, drones struck the Crimean Titan chemical plant in Armyansk. Roughly 23 successful hits. Production halted. Workers evacuated. At first glance, a chemical plant seems secondary. But here's the deeper meaning. Beyond being one of Eastern Europe's largest titanium dioxide producers, the facility makes sulfuric acid, the starting point in the production chain for artillery shells, explosives, and rocket fuel. You can destroy a finished ammunition depot, but striking the raw material that fills those depots produces a far more lasting effect. Layer 3, electricity. In the same wave, the Yani Kapu and Titan transformer centers were struck, vital nodes of the peninsula's electrical grid, feeding not just cities but industrial sites and military bases. Their loss complicated even basic emergency response. Firefighters were forced to battle the burning Crimean Titan plant in darkness. See how the layers feed each other. Transport feeds production. Production feeds energy. Cut one and you weaken the others. This is not a series of raids. It's an architecture of strangulation, and the 475th Regiment said exactly where it's going. This is not the end. More is coming, because the fortress that took 10 years to build is unraveling in 4. Step back and look at the full arc, because the timeline is the argument. After annexing Crimea in 2014, Putin spent a decade turning the peninsula into a military fortress. 400 air defense systems, Iskander ballistic missiles, Kaliber cruise missiles, new submarines, dozens of warships. Crimea became Russia's Black Sea anti-access/area denial zone, the A2/AD bubble. And the invincible fortress became a cornerstone of Kremlin propaganda. Alongside the steel came demographic engineering. More than 140,000 Crimean Tatars and ethnic Ukrainians pushed out. Hundreds of thousands of Russian citizens moved in. The annexation was meant to be irreversible. For 10 years, the narrative held. Then it began to unwind, and each year cut deeper. 2022, the flagship Moskva sunk by a Neptune missile. The symbol of Black Sea dominance hit the seafloor. 2023, the Kerch Bridge struck. The same year, 9 senior officials reportedly killed in the Storm Shadow strike on fleet headquarters. The myth of untouchability cracked. 2024, naval drones and missiles picked off fleet ships one by one. Most withdrew to Novorossiysk. Air bases began to be systematically destroyed. 2025, the air defense batteries targeted one by one. Air bases abandoned. 2026, the final act. Headquarters demolished in February. Bridges severed in June. Logistics collapsed. Command echelons fleeing. In 4 years, the invincible fortress became, step by step, an abandoned outpost. Atesh's forward-looking assessment is sober. The coming months could be the hardest for the occupation forces in Crimea since the war began. But the hardest months coming is not the same as the fortress having fallen, and calling Crimea lost would be premature. Here the picture has to be honest. The peninsula is still under Russian control, and Moscow's cards are not entirely spent. Tens of thousands of Russian soldiers remain. The air defenses, damaged as they are, keep operating. The Kerch Bridge's road lane is open, providing limited resupply, and Russia has survived a version of this before. At the end of 2022, it sustained its forces on the right bank of the Dnieper for months with ferries and temporary bridges after the spans were struck, then executed an orderly withdrawal. A similar adaptation for Crimea, air resupply, night convoys, alternative sea routes, is theoretically possible. The Kremlin's will to prolong the war and Russian society's threshold for pain should not be underestimated. But there's one difference between Crimea and Kherson that changes everything. In Kherson, Russia could choose to withdraw. It crossed to the far bank of the Dnieper and built a defensive line. In Crimea, that option is politically unavailable. Here is the paradigm shift. The old assumption was that Crimea was Russia's strongest card, the trophy that proved the whole project. The emerging reality is the inversion of that. Crimea has become the card Russia cannot play and cannot fold, because the peninsula is Putin's personal prestige project, declared annexed, declared an inseparable part of Russia. Withdrawing detonates a decade of narrative, but staying gets more expensive every week. Every struck bridge, every sunk ferry, every emptying shelf raises the cost of holding it. And that cost isn't abstract. It's drawn from Russia's war budget, cut from resources meant for other fronts, weakening the whole war effort. The harder Putin tries to hold Crimea, the greater his risk of losing the war. But letting go isn't possible either. That is the unsolvable equation. The cost of holding rises, the cost of releasing rises with it. and there is no third option. So return to where we started, a handful of commanders leaving without orders. We can now see what that small act actually was, not a relocation, but a verdict. Putin built a fortress in 10 years. Ukraine turned it into an outpost in 4. Crimea hasn't fallen, but the invincible fortress narrative has, and the Kremlin can neither explain that reality to its public nor hide it. The interior rots, the shelves empty, the commanders slip across the strait, and the line that once meant triumph has quietly reversed itself. 10 years ago, Crimea was Putin's greatest victory. Today, it is becoming his greatest vulnerability, the trophy that turned into the trap, which leaves the question hanging over everything that comes next. If a power can neither hold its fortress nor abandon it, who, in the end, decides how that ends? We'll keep following these developments. Subscribe to the Worldline Network to stay with the story as it unfolds. And if you'd rather keep the analysis going when you step away from the screen, find us on Spotify and turn the long drives and the traffic into something worth listening to. Thank you for watching.